Hello, all. We're continuing on and we're going to discuss the war on poverty this week. We're now studying into more recent history, the history of your parents, or in my case, some of my history. How similar or different is social welfare in the 1960s from what we've been studying? The growing population, the baby boom, declining number of births in the Depression, there were 17 per thousand. World War II exploded to 26.6 births per thousand from 1947 to 1965. There's also an increase in life expectancy. In 1940, it was 62.9 years. In 1970, it was 70.8 years. And in 2009, it's risen again to 78.5 years. So you can see that's a huge jump in how long people are expected to live. Um, there's shifts in location. People move to follow jobs. There's a continued shift from the rural to the urban population. By 1950, 64% of white population lived in urban areas, 62% non-white. 1970, 72% of white population lived in urban areas, 81% was non-white. South to the north, the percentage of blacks living in the South dropped. In 1940, it was 77%. By 1970, it's only 52%. There's a greater mobility, more mobility during the World War II period. This is often called the Second Great Migration because factories did actually go to the South and even sometimes recruit. Um, Also, automobiles become more affordable. Buses, commercial aircraft, and federally funded highways ease travel and location. The Highway Act that Eisenhower enacts is probably one thing that really changes this country transportation wise. Because of the proliferation of highways, we really become a car country. Um, and more cars equals more suburbs. People didn't have to live right where they worked, they could travel and commute. Poverty. The 1960s, we rediscovered poverty. The Other America, Poverty in the United States by Michael Harrington in 1962. Wealth and Power in America, Gabriel, Koloko. There was university research on the layers of poverty below the veneer of wealth. Um, Much like the 1920s, there's this idea that is coming about that even when we see prosperity in the upper and middle class, it doesn't mean that poverty's been eradicated in the working class and the lower middle class. Um, Response to the poverty influenced by three factors: depressed geographical areas, regional unemployment, resources depleted, so new industries needed to be introduced. 6 areas were identified: Appalachia, New England, coastal plains, the Ozarks, the upper Great Lakes, and the Southwest. Riots in urban centers: LA, Detroit, Newark, and Cincinnati. Unemployment, poverty, poor housing, crowded living conditions, economic exploitation, widespread desperation, and frustration and hopelessness. There's a change in who receives public assistance. The parallel rise and fall in unemployment and relief in the 1950s. 1960s witnessed significant increase in welfare recipients, up to 6 million. The profile changed. It's no longer widows and orphan children. A greater awareness of illegitimacy, divorce, and desertion. Continued to embrace the idea of the worthy widow when she was not the primary recipient. Now they were employable women but considered unworthy. Civil rights movement had nascent efforts. The civil rights was more of an issue after World War II. Soldiers who fought and lost their lives fighting fascism were not content to return home to segregation and a further denial of their own rights. Discrimination in defense employment resulted in racial classes. 35 just dead in Detroit. The NAACP was a legal defense fund, systematically attacked segregation. Poverty was 3 times as great for blacks as what whites experienced. Discriminatory employment practices continued. Growing movement focused on economic, social, and political discrimination, race and class issues, income, employment, education, skills, health, and dependency constituted a disproportionate number in the American society. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 prohibited racial, sexual, or ethnic discrimination in employment. It established the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, was established as an enforcement mechanism for this act. President Kennedy in 1960 eliminate whatever abuses has been crept into these programs, develop more constructive approaches to get people off assistance and useful roles in society. There's the Ad Hoc Committee on Public Welfare in 1961, reinforces and supports family life through rehabilitation, prevention, and protection. Financial assistance to needy persons and families, efficient administration, and organization of public welfare programs, research into the cause and dependence and family breakdowns, the provision of rehabilitation services by professionally trained personnel, aid to children. The Social Security Act of 1935 gave aid to dependent children. In 1961, the Aid and Services to Needy Families with Children, AFDC, Aid to Families with Dependent Children. It gave support to needy children and families to maintain their family life. Money extended for unemployed parents, but parents refusing to accept retraining. Work projects were viewed as an opportunity, not a penalty. Funds for daycare were authorized. There was a return to the seeking of the cause of poverty within the individual, offered personal counseling, provided job training and placement. A number of people received aid and increased rather than decreased as social workers predicted. Development in social welfare shaped by a public agenda rather than private agencies. There's a new relationship between the public and the private. It initiated the purchase of service, federal funds available for contracted services. The War on Poverty, celebrated and maligned. So the War on Poverty is probably one of the most controversial programs of the 20th century, and I want everyone to keep that in mind when we're doing our discussions, that everyone needs to think about that we're going to have some conflicting opinions on the War on Poverty. There's a variety of social theories. Kennedy's advisors, expanding Americans' capacity to consume was the key to sustained economic growth. It's a vicious cycle of poverty, focused on cycle and a behavior of the poor as a primary obstacle. Attacks on hunger and poverty combined with the civil rights movement, interracial disparity of solidarity. Kennedy had begun planning programs to deal with poverty before he was assassinated. Response to mass migration to urban centers by groups who had been left out of the mainstream American life. Displaced and unemployed blacks, mountain whites, Mexican Americans, and Native Americans, and Puerto Ricans. President Johnson declared a war on the domestic enemy which threatens the strength of our nation and the welfare of our people in a message to Congress. 20% of Americans were poor. Half of American blacks. Economic Opportunity Act of 1964 was a continuation of Kennedy's work. Youth program, young people of low income and minority groups. Job Corps training centers for out-of-school and unemployed youth. Work training programs, work study programs to continue school and college. Title III and Title IV combat poverty in rural areas. Title V supports families by training mothers and fathers. VISTA Volunteers, Adult Volunteer Corps for rehabilitation and improvement of urban slums. The Title II is Urban and Rural Community Action Program. And this is probably one of the most controversial. Maximum feasible participation of residents in a geographic region. Head Start, a preparatory education program for preschool low-income children. Upward Bound, an education program to prevent school dropouts or encourage them to return to school, daycare centers, neighborhood recreation centers, neighborhood health centers. It reflected that employment as an American value was as valuable as family life. Well-intentioned, but ill-conceived. Changes the victim, not the society. It emphasized education and training without the necessary funds for success. And it did not deal with the income and job creation. And it did little to deal with rural poverty. As I mentioned, the progressives also, there's a lot of focus for these on urban poverty. The Community Mental Health Act provided funds. It set up a community of mental health centers. The Food Stamp Act of 1964. It was an improvement over previous programs. It distributed commodities acquired through federal price supports. Available food was more about farmer surplus than good nutrition. It was intended to meet the nutritional needs of the poor. It separated operations of the program from the concerns of agricultural producers. In 1993, about 10.5% of the population. Medicare in 1965 was a health insurance for retirees and people with disabilities. Overcame medical opposition that persisted since the 1930s. Medicaid in 1965 is a health insurance for low-income individuals and farmers, or in families, excuse me. Okay, so disenchantment. City mayors did not feel like the federal money, they could control it, or they controlled the money and awarded it to the political cronies. It implied professional experts were a part of the problem, so it was necessary to pull the community in participation. Communities were threatened by aggressive voices of the poor as they found a means to express themselves. It was very costly. A person receiving aid doubled between 1960 and 1970, went from 6 million to 12 million people, about $3.1 billion. Political and social dissension. And in my opinion, one of the biggest defeats of the war on poverty is the distraction and the cost of the Vietnam War. There's a famous phrase that you can either afford to have guns or butter. And I think that Johnson felt like he had to choose the Vietnam War at this period. Congress shifted attention from protecting the poor to controlling the expansion of the AFDC. It did have positive impacts. Maximum feasibility participation opened a new source of psychological, financial, and political power so poor people could have a role in controlling the programs. Members, if a minority group, were visible and better heard. Foundations for Model Cities in 1966, which began to address the urban decline. The poor became more involved in education and healthcare programs. It provided professional and executive jobs to people who came through the programs and did not face discrimination. The development of community legal services. Social workers drew on community organizing, administration, and direct work with clients and client groups. The WIN program is the Work Incentive Program of 1967. It's based on old, but again, a popular belief that the deprivation and dependency were products of an individual, not the political economy. It argued that welfare compounds rather than solves the problem. A shift from the Social Security Act that strengthened the needy child's right to public support and a mother's care. It affirmed the right to remove the child from welfare rolls and to force his or her mother to work outside the home for support. Mothers no longer were encouraged to care for their children as they had with the mother's pension, but instead were required to work. Punitive aspects that affected children who would not receive support caused delays. Federal bureaucracy changes from Welfare Administration and Bureau of Family Services to Social Rehabilitation Services. Administer public assistance, rehabilitation, and social services. De-emphasize the family and the community services, rather rehabilitation. Separation of the social services from the cash assistance became standard assistance policy. Okay, this week, this is my reference slide. I know that for many of you, you're going to look at some of these social welfare programs that affect poverty, including Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. So be sure you check this out. Thanks, guys. You have a great week.